The Center for Disease Control has done a really interesting little bit of deception with this gene therapy that's been going around, which they disguise behind the term vaccine. The, Everybody has a conceptual framework of what a vaccine is. You take a weakened strain or a dead strain of the original object and train your immune system to recognize it. And when people hear this term, it's so deeply embedded that that's what they think this new jab is, when it's completely different. The fake zine is a gene therapy that reprograms the immunological response by actually training the body to create these spike proteins so that your body itself is constantly on alert for something which you yourself are in the act of producing. This is completely unlike anything that a vaccine has ever done before. And people can't resist the temptation to call it a vaccine. Every time they refer to it, it's like, well, it's the vaccine. So this creates that reassuring conceptual framework that this is nothing new and different when it really is. And this effect is so embedded, so subliminal, that it's almost impossible to break people out of saying it's just a vaccine. It's just perfectly normal. The CDC did a similar deception with chronic fatigue syndrome. The name brings up a conceptual framework of chronic fatigue, when that actually had nothing whatsoever to do with the entity that this syndrome was coined to study. The mystery being investigated by the CDC's Holmes Committee was of clusters of people in sick buildings who failed to recover from Epstein-Barr virus. So the original concept, the original term was chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, until it was found that these sick people weren't recovering from other viruses as well, such as cytomegalovirus and the newly discovered human herpes virus 6, or parvovirus, or just about anything. That should have been a tip-off right there that it's a problem of immune dysfunction and not of that particular virus. But the Center for Disease Control had a need to disguise the Lake Tahoe outbreak, so they gave it this trivializing name, hoping that gullible doctors would be fooled into treating it as if it were chronic fatigue. I didn't think the trick was going to work when they unveiled it. I told Dr. Cheney, that's so ridiculous. Everybody's heard that there was an outbreak. They know what the CDC was investigating. And if a medically educated person sees so much as one immune abnormality that was the direct, scary cause for the CDC's decision to create the syndrome, they'll realize this is not chronic fatigue. But I was wrong. The CDC was right. They called it. They knew that people were gullible. They weren't sure that people would fall for this ridiculous trick. But after a couple of years, it was clear that so many people had, and there were so few people who knew the difference that were trying to straighten out this mess, that the confused people were in the majority, and the chronic fatigue syndrome as a viable research entity had been destroyed. I still hope that I could use some of the publicity generated to get some researchers to come back and look at the actual evidence, which is, of course, is the toxic mold in the sick buildings. And much to my amazement, the people who were fooled by this ridiculous chronic fatigue trick battle against that concept, and the main way they do this is by saying, well, toxic mold can't account for everybody with chronic fatigue. Now, the syndrome wasn't coined for the problems of tired people the world over. It was a specific problem that they're trying to resolve. And if one adopts that attitude that chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome are congruent, they're the same thing, then you can never solve all the things that cause chronic fatigue. As I've said before, you could play tiddlywinks until you're exhausted and call it chronic fatigue syndrome. So I'm amazed that there's so many gullible people on this planet. I didn't expect it. And they are going to continue to battle to make sure that nothing is ever resolved, nothing ever can be resolved. Anything that comes up in the future that causes chronic fatigue or persistent tiredness instantly becomes, in their mind, chronic fatigue syndrome. So there are there's an untold number of future things that haven't even been invented yet. New chemicals, new pursuits, new all kinds of unimaginable things that will probably make people very tired, which instantly, in these confused people's minds, becomes chronic fatigue syndrome. So about the only way to even address this is to explain to people that they've been fooled, they've been bamboozled, and they've fallen into this ridiculous trap set by the CDC, and hopefully they'll feel a little bit of shame and shut up about it. Now, so far this hasn't worked because all they do is they argue harder and say, well, you're just trying to make it all about yourself. But even though these people, these angry, gullible, deluded people, are going to persist in their views no matter what, hopefully there will be people who are sick with mold who realize that there is no value in perpetuating this confusion, and they will go ahead and ignore the obfuscators, the confusion spreaders, and realize that if you want to deal with your chronic fatigue syndrome, your original mold-induced chronic fatigue syndrome, you've got to ignore these gullible people and stick with the mission. Study the mold, find its characteristics, learn how to avoid it, and then you've got a reasonable chance of dealing with this in an effective manner.